Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the only leftist Christian podcast in the entire world.
The only one? I feel like the Magnificast might want a word. Shitty Christians might want a word. Beer Christianity, they might want a word as well. How are you justifying this exactly?
Oh, we have to justify things. That shits things up a bit.
Do we not?
Okay, fine. I'll phrase it as far as I'm aware, we're the only leftist Christian podcast in the world. How does that do it?
I mean, I have just made you aware of some others, to be fair. All right, never mind. We'll go with that. We're the only leftist Christian podcast in the world.
I'm Jonny Bell, and I'm joined, as always, by Adam Spears. Today we are looking at Adam's article on exploring where the church's prophetic voice is in the UK. But first...
what else is on my mind, Grapes?
So I've got a mind grapes for this episode, and it comes from me going to Norwich Pride on the 27th of July. Where, well, there are two things about it. One, we saw some really good banners, and the other about getting rid of one of their sponsors. One of their sponsors was Aviva, and the Norwich Trans Pride had called for organisers to drop Aviva to be in solidarity with the siblings facing genocide in Palestine, because Aviva have ties with selling arms to Israel.
I mean, shocker, an insurance company that's evil? No.
I know, it was really shocking to most people, I think. But yes, and I thought that was a really, really good move, particularly as you've had some real problematic issues with not just sponsors, but who's involved with Pride, such as the police being right at the front of the parade in some of the years, at some of the major ones.
I just find it so incredible. Like, I guess Pride has changed from what it was dramatically to the point where the vast majority of people who participate in Pride, I don't think have a clue where it actually comes from.
I think you're right there, actually. And it's really concerning. And I mean, generally speaking, some people in the queer community have kind of aligned themselves with power. I mean, I've spoken about this before, about gay white men.
Wes Streeting.
Well, yeah. And it's very self-serving, and it forgets, as you say, the roots of Pride. The fact that it was trans women of colour who were the main propensitors of all queer rights. Like,
well, and that it started as a riot when the police attacked the queer community, right? Like, that people threw bricks. It was not what we now. I mean, look, I don't get a say in this because I'm not a member of the queer community, but to me, it's utterly bizarre that you can welcome in the very group that Pride started as a riot against because they were attacking them.
Yeah. And many of the issues are still not resolved.
And they can't be, by the way, until you abolish the police, let's be honest.
Yeah. Here's something that has just popped into my head that I don't really have many thoughts on, because I've only just thought of it. How similar is it to having police at Pride and Christians at Pride?
Yeah, it's something that I've thought about quite a lot. I don't think it's quite as on the nose because, Christianity, yes, on some level, many forms of it, by no means all, but many forms of it are part of the structures of power, but not inherently so. Christianity is not inherently part of the structures of power, whereas the police, just fundamentally, that is what it is. That's what it was created to do. Christianity was not created to do that. So I think it's possible to have a Christian presence there, from my point of view, that does not play into some of those deeper structural issues.
That's interesting. I'm going to give that some thought, I think. The other part of Norwich Pride is the placards, and there are some really quite beautiful things on there. And to also say that this year at Norwich Pride, trans people were at the front of the parade. So I think there's a real acknowledgement that trans people are, particularly trans youth, are really in danger in this country. So the placards read, and I had to quickly write them down on my phone, otherwise I would have forgotten about them. Does conversion therapy work on bigots? Cass is crass. Wes Streeting is a hate crime.
That's my favourite.
It is a very good one.
Incredible.
Keir Starmer equals queer harmer. Transphobia, it's the same until it's Keir Starmer, and then it's not. Bagel, shut your mouth.
Bagel agrees.
Yeah. no pride in genocide. And actually, this was with the Palestinian flag on the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there was another one saying, protect children from the Tories, but that's crossed out and it says, Wes Streeting.
Could have just left it at Tories, to be honest.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, it was really refreshing, actually. And whilst it's the biggest Pride event in Norfolk, because Norfolk's quite low population density and everything and quite in the arse end of nowhere, I think there is a potential for being able to have a bit more revolutionary or radical Pride events, which I thought was quite good.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Adam, we have your article called Where is the Church's Prophetic Voice? Did you want to say a bit about what led you up to writing that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a critique of the church, like, well, I guess all of us do on this podcast. But as an Anglican myself, I find it very frustrating that the Church of England, it's really intertwined with politics, with the politics of this country. And it has certain ways of thinking and certain ways of doing things and certain ways of justifying the way it is set up that I don't think are very good, to put it bluntly. And I think there are a lot of sort of contradictions and issues around that you can see often in certain speeches and sermons and so on. You know, everything we see and hear and do is grounded in one or more ideological positions and assumptions. And the Church of England is absolutely grounded in ideological positions and assumptions. And I find that fascinating when you look at things like, and I've sort of used Justin Welby's sermon that he gave at the service for the new Parliament recently as a framing device to look at some of that stuff, because I think there's often a bit of a disparity between what the church says and how it behaves around power and what it says and how it behaves around those who don't really hold very much power. And I think you can see that in this sermon. So, you know, the article isn't written to be a Justin Welby is bad kind of article, but it is a way in to sort of look at how the church has framed some of this stuff and thinks about some of this stuff.
Yeah, and how people frame things when they talk about it, whether they're Justin Welby or whoever, is obviously kind of gives you insights to those sort of ideological assumptions.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think, you've done well to use it as a platform to then delve deeper into what's happening politically. And actually, the article that you've written kind of feels quite prescient with what's been happening as we're recording just after the weekend, with the many different riots, protests, whatever you want to call them, that have been happening in the far right throughout a number of different cities in the UK, which is concerning. But there is a potential that because we've got a different party in power, because there's been a change, some of those tensions that have been bubbling under the surface are coming up to the surface now. And my hope is, I don't know how realistic it is, but hope isn't always realistic, is that it's going to be quite good because it makes things more apparent so you can then actually deal with the issues that are underlying. You know, once something's more explicit, you can talk more easily about it, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're right there. I think one of the fascinating things was between the riots that we've been seeing over the last week or so and the riots that took place in 2011, so not too long after we saw the new coalition government come to power. The riots had a different character because the riots that have been happening recently are very much sort of far right in character. The 2011 riots were not. They were started after the shooting of Mark Duggan. So they were very much a kind of reaction to overbearing authoritarian policing, which has only got worse. And a lot of the policies that were being put in place at the time and had been for a couple of years since the financial crisis hit, that were really starting at that point, just starting to affect people. One of the broad points that I'm kind of making in this article is that you cannot spend years cutting everything, every budget, every public service to the bone and not expect pushback. And that's one of the things that these two riots had in common. As I say, very different in terms of what precipitated them and what they are after, but both, I think, grounded in some real material issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say in the article that people are angry, and people are rightly angry. And thinking about that materialist critique, you'd say that they're alienated because of all their freedoms and welfare and access to things are slowly being taken away. But that anger is being directed towards things other than the people who are making the decisions that are affecting them, and then therefore being used towards scapegoats.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that we should be very aware of here is that Keir Starmer, he's been Prime Minister, for about a month now, and when the 2011 riots were happening, and in the aftermath of that, Keir Starmer wasn't yet a politician. He was Director of Public Prosecutions. And I'd like to recommend a book at this point. There's a wonderful book called The Starmer Project by Oliver Eagleton. And it really goes into Starmer's transition from claimed kind of left-wing firebrand in his sort of youth and early adulthood to what he is now and what he has been for a long time since he was Director of Public Prosecutions, which is an authoritarian. You can see that authoritarian streak very, very clearly in the aftermath of the 2011 riots. For example, with him making personal appearances in court and praising judges for slapping custodial sentences on people for doing things like stealing a pair of trainers, right? This is not something that warrants a custodial sentence. It only makes things worse. And what you're doing with that kind of thing is you are criminalizing people who have got caught up in the moment. And yeah, we might want to have something, we don't just want to be necessarily just be like, well, you can do whatever you like, but we do need to realize that when you send people to prison for a very low level offense, you are running a risk there because you could well be creating someone who actually is a hardened criminal at a later stage.
Indeed. Yes.
Before we even start to think about some sort of deeper critiques of, whether stealing a pair of trainers in a riot from a massive global corporation is actually redistribution. Before we even think about that, we have to realize that your authoritarian response to that is going to cause a lot more problems down the line, right? And I think this is part of what we're seeing right now. We're also seeing, before the current riots were going on, we've seen Labour coming out with really authoritarian policies and rhetoric, talking about how, well, in reference to the riots, actually, Keir Starmer said that, people would pay for what they had done. Really retributive form of apparent justice. And last thing on this that I want to say is that I can't remember exactly what area it was. It might be generally, but one analysis recently of what people steal, the most stolen item, most shoplifted item, is Calpol, right?
Wow.
Calpol is paracetamol. That's all it is. It's paracetamol for children. It has no street value, right? And Starmer is talking about cracking down on shoplifting. Well, how about you crack down first on the poverty that makes people steal Calpol for their kids?
Yes, which is, oral paracetamol that has sugar in it, basically. That's all it is.
I think it's sugar-free these days.
Oh, are they? They probably are, to be fair. I haven't looked very carefully at them because I don't have that much to do with young kids other than my niece.
But unless people are stealing this stuff because it's really tasty, which it is.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
But you can also very easily overdose some paracetamol and make yourself quite poorly.
Yeah. Worth it.
Yeah. And it's interesting actually with Starmer because you can see when it was the two-child benefit cap vote that he recently did, he suspended, was it 6?
7.
7. Number of completion.
I mean, that's fairly apt, isn't it? Because I'm pretty sure that Starmer sees himself as God, so...
But yeah, that in itself is authoritarian. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, you didn't vote how I wanted, so I'm going to suspend you.
That's his modus operandi, right? That is his modus operandi. And the precedent for this was set by Boris Johnson after the Brexit vote, when he suspended something like 21 members of the Tory party who had voted against his Brexit deal. It wasn't something that you did prior to that. Now, if you were a cabinet member or a shadow cabinet member, you might have to quit your role as a member of the cabinet or shadow cabinet before you voted against the party. But suspending the whip from those who vote against the party is new. You know, it is come in with Boris Johnson and continued by Keir Starmer, and it's really authoritarian. And I really wish people would see this in Keir Starmer, because this is a key part of who he is and how he runs his party and how he is now running the country.
Yes. One of the things in your article that we have been talking about in terms of Starmer's authoritarianism, but more widely is about power and that kind of lack of awareness that lots of people have power and don't realize that they're wielding it, basically. Yeah, and that is quite prevalent. I mean, you say about the Church of England and people in sort of leadership roles there, but it's also quite prevalent, I think, in any church space. I see it a lot in the Methodist Church of people who do have positions of a lot of authority, actually, and there's an issue, and then they go, well, I can't do anything about this. I don't have any power. And it's like, well, yes, you do. By talking to someone about this particular issue and saying that it's not okay, that's actually doing something. It's quite often.
Yeah, and I think this is, I brought this up partly because of my own experience within the church and people sort of exercising power unknowingly or in a way that was detrimental to people. So that's part of it. But it was also the interview that Welby did, which I think I've referenced in the article, with GQ magazine a few years ago, where he was asked, do you feel powerful? And he just said, no, just straight up, no. Basically, his point was there aren't a lot of things where I can just do this and that's what happens, which I'm not sure he's entirely correct there. But his point is that he doesn't have that sort of too much of that kind of direct power to affect change in a direct way, like an absolute monarch would or something. But that, most of what his position entails is politics, is talking with people. And this is kind of my point, is that is power. That is a kind of power, especially when you have that ability to do that with the Prime Minister, basically any member of Parliament, any lord, with the monarch, basically anyone you want, you can talk to them. And to claim that is not a form of power, I think it's a problem, because until you recognize that is a form of power, how are you going to recognize that you have a prophetic voice in this, or could rather have a prophetic voice.
Yeah. There's a weird contradiction in all of this, because it's like saying, oh, we don't have power because we don't have that ability to dictate and have things done as a result. But at the same time, we're told to do things as ministers and priests and whatnot, told not to talk about our own personal political views. But surely that means that we have power to influence if we can share our political views, and we're therefore not allowed to.
I think there's an assumption that the gospel isn't political, and that could not be further from the truth.
Well, indeed. Yeah. That point of view I don't really understand, because you've got to... It's like apologetics. You've got to tie yourself in huge knots in order to justify your position, rather than going, well, look, it's here and here and here and here, and that's just one page. It's incredibly frustrating when people who do have a lot of influence don't realise it, and they ended up being very damaging as a result, because they're not realising what they can do. It's almost... I don't know whether driving a car would be a good metaphor for this, but it's like, being on the road saying, oh, I can't influence other people on the road, but all the while you're crashing into things and causing damage to other cars, and saying, but I don't have any control, which is nonsense. And actually, I know you said about your personal experience from the church, but mine too has been really bad. And many others have been quite bad, particularly the people who are not of the kind of cis-het male, white, middle class, etc. And that does, again, come from that lack of awareness of realizing that people have a huge amount of influence on things, on issues, and over people.
And I think you talk about a contradiction, and that's something that I point to in the article as well, but specifically within the Church of England, is that I think there's a contradiction in that the church claims that, particularly as an established church, it is there for everyone. And, there are people who try to make that work. This is my point in the article. There are clearly good people within the church doing grassroots work who really feel that the church should be there for everyone. But at a structural level, that can never be fully realized, because until you start structuring the church in a way that recognizes that sides with the material needs of the average person rather than the material needs of the state, you're never going to actually be a church that is for everyone. You can't be. In fact, I'm not sure you can be a church for everyone at all anyway, unless you realize that calling on the rich to give up their power and wealth is in some sense for them as well.
Yeah, and that point about the church being for everyone is a bit of a nonsensical one, because there have been so many different expressions of what it is to be a lover of Christ ever since Jesus was walking on the earth, even before his death and resurrection and ascension. So it's really weird that we think that the church, a particular denomination or expression of church or whatever, has to be the one that's for everyone. And to think that the Church of England can fulfill that role is quite egotistical, actually, of any church that does that.
Yeah, but I think, that is ultimately the contradiction at the heart of the Church of England. It thinks that to be a state church is to be for everyone. Well, not everyone even agrees that the state has any legitimacy. So, how are you really going to be there for those people?
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it is still almost a hangover from when it was more of a theocracy with a monarchy type model. I mean, even when the Church of England was formed, religion was starting to lose its power, and it was almost like a reactionary trying to gain it. Okay, so we'll make sure that the church is the state church and it controls the country in a sense, or has a control over the country. And it's still stuck in that way of operating, despite not being able to operate like that, which is possibly what Welby's getting at when he says he doesn't
Yeah, I
feel
think so.
powerful. Yeah, how interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, the Church of England, we say that it was formed at a time when it was more of a theocratic kind of thing. I think, yes, to an extent, but the Church of England was formed as a church that actually kind of didn't have the kind of power that it had previously had. And actually, if we look at the nature of the church since the Elizabethan settlement, actually even the monarchy didn't have as much power as it had.
Yes.
So it's a weird thing where we're talking about institutions that absolutely, yes, still hold a lot of power, but they're sort of held in a kind of tension, in a balance, where power is still not really invested in the people, even in a supposedly democratic country like our one. Yeah, we can go and vote, but if you're going to vote for people who fundamentally oppose your interests, it's this person who opposes your interests, or it's this person who opposes your interests. How is that democratic? And I think the church could be a prophetic voice that points a lot of this stuff out, but it can't be that, in my opinion, until it throws off its own power. This is my sort of theological point, if you like, at the end of this, is that Jesus engages in this process of kenosis, which is a casting off, if you like, a rejection of his own power as God, and a handing over of that power to some extent to those who would kill him. And I don't think the church can adequately reflect the gospel until it does the same.
Yeah. And I very much agree with that. It's that thing of holding on more to our weaknesses than our powerfulnesses.
Which is scary, by the way. Right? We should recognize that what we're asking the church to do here is a scary thing. But that's kind of what the gospel is. It's to take on something that should, to anyone, bring fear to them, and to say, actually, there is no fear in this, because actually the gospel is not based in fear. It is based in love. And until you embrace that love for everyone and cast off that fear of the unknown, of not having access to power, not being powerful yourself, until you do that, you cannot claim that you are living out the gospel.
And that would also require people like me, which would also be people in the Church of England who are rectors, priests, and so on, to not necessarily have as nice houses or be paid in the same way, or...
There's a lot of structural stuff that needs to change around this.
Exactly.
You look at where theological colleges are.
Yeah.
Name for me a theological college that isn't in a really rich, leafy area.
Yeah, I don't know of any, but that's possibly some Methodist, and I don't know all the many, many different Anglican ones. But there is something that I find unsettling. Like for me personally, being a minister, I get my house through the church, and I get my stipend, my essentially my wages, as it were, through the church. And if I didn't have that, that's quite scary. I mean, particularly as I don't own property, and actually this is the most I've ever earned. But most of my colleagues have taken a sort of a reduction in pay, and a lot of them have their own home that they'll be able to retire to. I don't have that. So the risk for me is a lot greater than someone who has all those things. And particularly as my husband, he has quite a quote unquote working class job, as it were, because he's earning less than £1,000 a month kind of thing. But here I am holding on to my values and going, well, actually, we do need to get rid of that, or at least change it in some way. Because despite all those things, I'm living far better than I have done materially for a long time, or ever, actually.
But you don't have the security.
No.
And I think this is the thing, is what capitalism does to us, is it gets us thinking about, well, how am I going to afford this in the future? How am I going to prepare for my retirement? How am I going to do this? Because we don't live in a society that allocates based on need. We live in a society that allocates based on the ability to pay, right?
Yes.
And the church has bought into that, despite what we see in, Acts 2 and Acts 4 about, sharing everything in common and all the rest of it. That is out the window, and actually, if we were taking this seriously, maybe you'd have a house provided, fine, but you'd have a house provided that was, commensurate to your need.
To an extent, the Methodist Church does that. but it does it as an average. So the house I live in, from the others that I have seen, tends to be on the smaller side, but that's fine. But we have a kind of standardization of what they should do at a minimum because we're itinerant. We get moved every 5 years or so. So you've got to be able to cater to different sizes of families or not families.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I recognize it's not, these things, especially within a capitalist society, it's hard to work these things out sort of properly. I don't think it's necessarily impossible, but it does take some thinking about what that looks like. But again, this is one of those things where, are we taking the gospel seriously on this? Because you need to have a house that matches your need, but you also need to have pay and pension and all of this kind of thing that matches your need. And that kind of thing for me at the moment, barely even enters my mind because I'm not at the point where I can think about that.
Just thinking about some of the other, I guess, perspectives or ways of interacting with all of this. The people who are on the far right who are rioting, one of the things I wonder that if you were to say to them that actually we need to change how things are done, and that may make things a bit more uncomfortable for you for a time, when they're already in a great deal of discomfort because of the way policies have been and way things are, how do you think that is going to be received?
I'm not convinced that it does have to be less comfortable for those people. I don't, it depends who they are, right? There are definitely going to be some people on the far right, for sure, particularly those with a lot of say, who are sort of recruiting and coming up with a lot of the kind of ideas, who are people of means, shall we say. We know that the core figures in fascist movements in the past and in the present have been and are people who are, well, they're not the ones betraying their class. Let's put it that way, right? It makes perfect sense for them to try and foment fascism in society at large, right? And they are people who absolutely would be made less comfortable, potentially in various ways. But some of those people, particularly in sort of post-industrial communities, like the ones I've lived in the past, those are not people that we should be saying life is going to be a bit harder for you for a while, because some of those people, I think probably a sizable number of those people are people who are finding life difficult, especially at the moment, especially after 14 years or more of austerity. By no means all. Don't get me wrong. As I say this, I'm not saying that this is the case. I think some of those people are absolutely doing all right and just think that they're not. And some of those people are just, frankly, driven by racism. But a lot of this is fomented in people who have felt their quality of life go down. I think I saw a statistic earlier that said that we are basically £8,000 on average poorer, each of us, than we should be because of austerity. Tory austerity is responsible, arguably, for 335,000 excess deaths just between 2012 and 2019. And austerity was longer than that. So how many more people have been economically murdered, as one academic put it? So we're not saying that these people, their life needs to get worse, even for a bit. What we're saying is there are people who are driving this who want you to see the other and to other them, who want you to think that these people are the ones causing all of the problems that we have in society, rather than those who have been creaming off the top of your wages or not investing into communities that really need the investment. And you can see this in the current government. So you've got Rachel Reeves, who says that Labour's fiscal rules are non-negotiable. These are 3 rules that she, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, has decided that Labour is going to abide by, that she's just made up, right? And they are rules that tie her to a neoliberal economic order that is almost identical to the one that the Tories before Labour had as well. George Osborne has just released an episode of his podcast with Ed Balls saying that Rachel Reeves is a mini-me, saying that there's nothing in this that wouldn't have been in his budget. And that tells you a lot, because we're not looking at a government that is fundamentally different to the ones that we've had for the last 14 years.
It all felt a bit familiar. It all felt a bit deja vu. In fact, it felt like a bit mini-me. It was a bit like a George Osborne statement from 14 years ago. I don't think there was anything she announced that I would have violently disagreed with or not done myself. In fact, it was almost identical in structure and form to what I did in the first couple of months that I was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So, continuity Osborne.
Goodness me, poor Rachel Reeves. How's she going to cope with that? I mean, heir to George Osborne was not how I think she saw the start of her chancellorship.
But the central economic judgments she's taking are very classic orthodox Treasury judgments, which I was comfortable with because they were consistent with my own political philosophy.
Rachel Reeves has cancelled major infrastructure projects that would bring investment, that would bring jobs, that would bring money to people's pockets, because she's running an austerity budget. That's what she's doing. And the thing is, the church could call this out. The church is in a position to say, this is wrong. This is wrong. And it does call out some individual things, like the 2-child benefit cap. It's spoken out about that. Welby's spoken out about that. So has Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York. And that's great. But they're not speaking out about the core of it. You know, they're not speaking out about these fiscal rules, about neoliberalism. And that's what we need. And I think the reason they don't do that is because it does actually get to the core of power. And it does mean that you start to set yourself properly against the status quo. And I don't think you can do that in an established church. I just don't think it even enters their minds.
No, and I would almost argue that when Welby and Cottrell and others, they haven't spoken out against these things. They've commented on it because it's been in the press so much. Instead of going to the press and highlighting it and going, look at this thing, it's really unjust, they're joining in with the already present discord and just commenting on it. So even then, they're not being the prophetic voice. But no, it's helpful to think about the impact of things on others and to get a better picture, because I do feel quite ill-equipped sometimes for these things and what's going on. I mean, that's probably because I'm such a postmodernist. But but it's also, you can only know what you know. So I don't know whether this would be useful, but like for someone like me, I've got 6 congregations.
Yeah.
What practical thing could I do to canonically pour out our power to others, or rather, I suppose, to build communities?
I think we really need to take this down to a grassroots level. There's a lot of ways in which it's really hard to be the minister of 6 churches, right? I recognise that. There's lots of ways in which it's hard to just be the church. I think we need to recognise, actually, though, that there are also strengths that churches have. Churches, they often view their buildings as a bit of a millstone, something that is hard to administer, hard to keep up with. The churches that are doing the best with their buildings are the churches that really invest in their communities, that, yes, they still are a church, they still have their services and whatever, but actually their church becomes a community hub, right? That's what we could do with our church buildings. They could become a community hub. There's all this space, all of these, resources that could be used to invest in our communities, to have things like social supermarkets, to have things like mental health groups, to have things like citizens' advice coming in to offer advice to communities directly, rather than being sat in an office in the centre of town or whatever. There's any number of things that we can do that really start to make the best of our resources as churches on the ground. And I really encourage churches to start looking into some of that stuff, and some are, obviously, as I say,
indeed,
churches that do the best at this are the churches that are engaging with these community projects. I do think, though, it's important to recognise that when we're looking at community work, I spoke earlier about how everything is based in ideology, right? And that's no different for things like church work, community work, that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to be aware of the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of what is going on. So I would say always look to take a more Freirean approach. If anybody listening to this is unaware of Paulo Freire, then absolutely go and read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Maybe as a Christian, go and look at things like The Gospel in Salentinomi by Ernesto Cardenal. These are really key texts, I think, for any church looking to engage with this kind of thing. And I think this can also be reflected in our services as well. So, I talk about Gospel in Salentinomi. What that is written down conversations that Ernesto Cardenal, who was this Catholic priest, had with his peasant communities. And instead of having a sermon, you would have, or maybe there would be a sermon in that particular one, but this is something you can do in our churches if you like. But instead of having a sermon, you sit down and you discuss the readings for that Sunday. And the stuff that comes out of that, rather than having one, usually white middle-aged man stood at the front of the church telling everyone what to think, the stuff that can come out of actually everyone having an input, everyone having a say, everyone chewing the fat on this stuff and talking about how it relates to their community, to their situation, to wider society, is really quite profound. So, yeah, I think these are some of the things that we can do, some of the ways we can start to engage with some of these ideas.
Yeah, and actually something that is quite good in Methodism, it's not as commonplace as it used to be, but small groups where we do that work of looking at the passage and going, well, how does that apply to us? Where are we in this? Or where is that in us?
And in those, when you say us, you have to include not just the group that you are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But the wider community and even, the world, start small and work outwards.
And there's something that might be quite interesting to do an episode on is the sheer amount of governance and administration that churches have to do now. And me as a minister have to do. I mean, I've spent a lot of today already on paperwork, on risk assessments and data entry, and that's not my gifting.
Feel that.
But it's something that's necessary to do, particularly more so with the churches I have, because there are fewer people who are capable of doing things. And a lot of them, they wouldn't necessarily like to be called this, but they would be classed as vulnerable adults.
Yeah.
So there is less people power to be able to do as much. But there's still, I've got a church with 5 members, and there's still the amount of governance they have to do is similar to a church that has 150, 200 members.
Yeah.
And that is bonkers.
The bureaucracy, this is a wider problem as well. It's not just churches. The bureaucracy that has now become the norm, right? And I'm not talking about, when people talk about, we just need to cut red tape so we can save money and, no, there are some things that you need to do, right? A really good example of this is safeguarding, right? Safeguarding is really a really important piece of bureaucratic work that we have to do, right? Or involves bureaucratic work. There's more to it than that, right? So some of this stuff is absolutely important. But there's a lot of stuff in there, in churches and in jobs in general, that is just completely... It seems there to... I've been in jobs where I've had this stuff put in front of me and, it's almost given me a meltdown. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's so confusing.
Yes.
Right? And so bloody pointless that you're sat there looking at it, thinking, I don't know what they want me to do, but even their goals for this are utterly pointless. Let me do my job.
Yeah, indeed. And there's something in it to do with power and the ability to action things as well, because I think there's an element of it occludes power and what you can and can't do, but also it prevents you from being spontaneous sometimes, from being able to have the resources to do things. If I had like a full-time administrator for all my churches to do all the paperwork, like that would be great. And they can just get on with the things they need to do. Yeah. But that's like a full-time person's role.
Yeah. And some churches have that, right?
Yeah.
But they tend to be the bigger churches who can afford to have that.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it comes back to that being able to earn, or is it based on ability thing that capitalism, takes away from us? But no, it would be interesting to talk about that, because it's a really stifling thing, particularly in a rural context. Yeah. It's the church serving those systems rather than those systems serving the church.
And we need to break out, it's one of the sort of mindsets that we really need to break out of, that I think is included in a lot of what I'm sort of saying here.
Yeah, and perhaps that giving up of power could also mean giving up of that much administration, which would be quite liberating.
Yes, it absolutely would. Yeah, there is an authoritarianism to bureaucracy. There really is. And unless we break both of those things, we're going to become less and less relevant, I think.
I think we'll leave it there on that note, looking forward. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. The article that Adam has written is going to be linked in the show notes, and hopefully we'll even have an audio thingy that you'll be able to listen to it. Do get in touch with us, because we do love to hear from various people, and the contact details are in the description on the website.
You can even send us a text message if you look in the show notes. So if you've got anything to say, send us a text.
Very exciting. Great. Our website is breadandrosaries.com. You can find us on Patreon, and if you would like to help support us, that would be wonderful. You can also support us by rating and reviewing us, which is incredibly helpful. And you can find us on Twitter at breadandrosaries, email breadandrosaries@gmail.com, and the Facebook page, which you can find us at Bread and Rosaries. Adam, where can we find you?
You can find me on many social media platforms at CommieXIAN.
And I'm not really on social media. I don't tend to do that, so you can't really find me anywhere. Thank you for today, Adam. And
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye-bye.